Good morning, and thank you for joining UCI Mind today for a live discussion and Q&A on the link between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. I'm Chelsea Cox, Associate Director of Education for UCI Mind, which is one of 32 Alzheimer's disease research centers in the country designated by the National Institutes of Health. This episode is part of a monthly Q&A series where live viewers have the opportunities to ask questions of our nation's leading experts in Alzheimer's, brain health, and related dementia research. Joining me today on the topic of Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome is Mr. Eric Doran. He is the manager of the UCI MIND Down Syndrome Program. Good morning, Eric. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. Thanks so much for joining us to discuss
Sure.
Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease and some of your research.
Sure.
So before we get started, I'd just like to briefly introduce Mr. Doran. Mr. Doran holds a master's degree in genetic counseling from UCI, and he's been involved with the UCI Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, working with individuals with Down syndrome and their family members for the past 20 years. Eric's research is focused on development and aging in individuals with Down syndrome, with a primary focus on the important connection between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. And he's published numerous important findings on this topic. So thanks again, Eric, for joining me today to discuss this topic of Alzheimer's disease research that many people might not know about. And to our viewers who are joining us live this morning, if this is your first time joining us, I'll start by asking Eric a few questions on the topic. And then as you have questions that come up, please go ahead and type them here in the comments box, and Eric will address as many questions as he has time for. Please do remember that on Facebook, all of your questions will be linked to your name and visible to others. So Eric, to get us started, many people, like I said, might not know that people with Down syndrome are at a significantly increased risk to get Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's dementia.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit more about that and explain this unique link.
I think that's an excellent place to start. I should probably start by briefly explaining a little bit about the cause or the origin of Down syndrome itself. So Down syndrome is a genetic disorder that's caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21. Each of the cells in our body typically has 23 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 46. Our chromosomes are made up of DNA, and they contain many thousands of genes that code for proteins that make up the building blocks and the machinery that keep our cells and our bodies functioning and alive. Typically, each of us inherits one pair of each pair of the chromosomes from each of our parents. But as I mentioned, people with Down syndrome inherit an extra copy of chromosome 21. So they have 3 copies instead of the usual 2. That is why Down syndrome is also known as trisomy 21, tri meaning 3 and somy referring to the chromosome body 21. So chromosome 21 contains more than 200 genes, and it's this extra genetic material from this third copy of chromosome 21 that's present in people with Down syndrome that's responsible for the development of the characteristic facial features of Down syndrome or the common intellectual disability. But within this genetic material, there's a gene called the amyloid precursor protein, or APP for short. And this gene codes for a protein called amyloid. And this protein, amyloid, is the primary factor driving the development of Alzheimer's disease, both in people with Down syndrome and people without. So the typical brain changes of Alzheimer's are the development of what we call plaques and tangles. The plaques are comprised of clumps of abnormal amyloid protein, and these plaques, together with the tangles, cause brain dysfunction and the symptoms of dementia that we see in people with Alzheimer's disease. And the extra copy of this APP gene in people with Down syndrome results in an excess production of amyloid. So this results in a progressive accumulation of amyloid in the brain to the extent that virtually all people with Down syndrome will develop the brain changes of Alzheimer's, that is, these plaques and tangles, by age 40 years. And probably the main reason why many people are not aware of this link between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's is the fact that people with Down syndrome are now living much longer today than they did in the recent past. Life expectancy is now age 60, which is almost triple what it was even in 1980. So for all of us, the biggest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease is advancing age. And now that people with Down syndrome are living longer, they're all living into their peak risk years. So we are now seeing a dramatic increase in the number of affected individuals. And increasingly, we are seeing stories about the link between these two conditions in popular media. And this link is also now being recognized, and the significance of Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome among doctors and research scientists.
So, Eric, you mentioned that virtually all people with Down syndrome develop the pathology of Alzheimer's disease in their brains. So that is plaques and tangles by a certain age. And we're seeing this more and more as people with Down syndrome are living longer lives. You mentioned to around age 60. But I want to distinguish between the pathology or the disease in the brain versus the symptomology of Alzheimer's disease.
Excellent. That is a perfect point. Perfect point.
So does this mean if all people have pathology in their brains, does that necessarily mean that all people with Down syndrome will experience the symptomology of the disease, such as memory loss?
Right. In a word, that answer is no. Okay. Not all people with Down syndrome will develop the symptoms of dementia, despite the fact, as I mentioned, they all have the characteristic pathology by age 40, and they live a long life. We've worked with individuals with Down syndrome who have lived into their 60s and 70s and beyond and never developed memory loss or dementia. However, while it's true that not all people with Down syndrome will develop symptoms of dementia, unfortunately, most will. Our current best estimates are that about 25% of individuals will experience symptoms in their 40s, about 50% of individuals will experience symptoms in their 50s, and about 60-70% of individuals will experience symptoms in their 60s. And currently, the average age of onset of dementia for people with Down syndrome is about age 53. But as I mentioned, advancing age is the significant risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. But a key difference in people with Down syndrome is that their peak risk years are about 20 to 30 years earlier than what we see in the non-Down syndrome population. So when we see Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome, we often refer to it as what's known as an early onset Alzheimer's. That is development of Alzheimer's dementia before the age of 60. And this fact that some people with Down syndrome develop dementia earlier in their 40s and some not until later in their 60s and some never at all, even though they may live into their 70s. And knowing that they all have these brain changes, but there's all of this variability in the age of onset and whether you get it or you don't. This variability suggests to us that there are other factors other than the genetic factors of APP or the brain pathology that I described earlier that may increase, decrease, or even eliminate the risk of Alzheimer's dementia in somebody with Down syndrome. And in fact, many of our research objectives are exploring other genetic, biological, health, lifestyle factors that may explain the reasons for this variability. And if we can get an improved understanding of these factors, it may help us and help others develop diagnostic tools, maybe identify promising therapeutic targets to prevent or to treat and possibly even prevent Alzheimer's disease altogether.
Eric, we have a question here that I think you already answered partially. from one of our viewers, are people with Down syndrome and autism more likely to have Alzheimer's disease, and at what percentage? And you did give some percentages that about 25% of people with Down syndrome start to experience symptoms of dementia in their 40s, 50% in their 50s, and 60 to 70% in their 60s. Do you know of any studies related to autism and the risk for Alzheimer's disease in later life?
Unfortunately, we don't. And in fact, studies of autism and its links to Down syndrome have really only occurred since about 1999 or 2000. Prior to that time, it was thought that autism was a condition that could not co-occur with Down syndrome. But since that time, we're learning more and more about the co-occurrence, and we think about 5% of people with Down syndrome will have co-occurring autistic disorder. But there really haven't been any studies that looked at older people with Down syndrome with that dual diagnosis and their risk to develop Alzheimer's as they age. Now, whether or not someone has a history of Alzheimer's is certainly one of the data points that we track on all of our patients. So hopefully one day we'll get enough data on people that have that dual diagnosis to have some information to share about whether they may be at an increased risk or a decreased risk or whatever it may be. Okay. But we're not there yet.
So Eric, what are some of the symptoms to look out for? So if a person with Down syndrome does start to experience cognitive changes associated with Alzheimer's disease, what do you typically look for?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So when we think about symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, I think all of us initially think of a decline in memory function. We think of short-term memory problems or recent memory problems as opposed to long-term memory. So forgetting where we put something that was important to us, like our keys or glasses or a wallet, or struggling to remember recent events such as what we did last weekend or what we may have had for breakfast. These sorts of memory changes are common in the early symptoms of dementia in people with Down syndrome, but changes in personality and behavior are more commonly seen in people with Down syndrome in the early stages of the disease than in the non-Down syndrome population. I always stutter on that word. Anyway, so in addition to these memory changes, personality changes are common, such as being less interested in usual activities or social interactions. So symptoms that can look a lot like a depression. Some of the early behavioral changes can include increased irritability, stubbornness, anxiety, or even just an escalation in the frequency and intensity of long-standing behavioral traits. Changes in the ability to carry out activity of daily living skills such as personal hygiene or dressing are also common. In the very early stages, these tasks tend just to take longer to complete, but then eventually someone may be forgetting a sequential step in a task. So for example, they may get out of the shower and the shampoo is still in their hair, or they may put a shirt on and get it on backwards. Another common issue is having difficulty completing tasks they once mastered, such as work tasks or chores and things like that. Another early symptom is a loss of balance or coordination when walking in particular. And this usually presents as changes in activities of daily living do, where there's just a general slowing at first, but then eventually there's difficulty that can show when trying to walk up and down stairs or curbs or getting in and out of a car. There will be a hesitancy with where to place their feet. You can see this if an individual is trying to walk across a floor and they come to a transition in the flooring. So if you could picture a white carpet going to a black tile, that transition causes them to hesitate, stop before it, and do this odd step over before continuing on. And this sort of motor impairment can be a significant source of anxiety for the affected individual. Becoming disoriented in place and time is often an early symptom as well. So not remembering how to get from room to room in the house, or becoming lost in the neighborhood that you were once familiar with, or having trouble remembering what day it is. People with Down syndrome usually have an excellent memory for the birthdays of everybody in their family and almost everybody they've ever met. So families will often say, wow, we've noticed they forgot a birthday. One other important feature to be aware of that's seen much more commonly in people with Down syndrome is new onset seizure. This is somewhat distinct from Alzheimer's disease in people without Down syndrome. So that new onset seizure can occur either in the early, middle, or late stages. And finally, changes in sleep patterns are also very common as well, where individuals start going to bed later, waking up earlier, or doing a lot of sleeping during the day.
We have a great question here from one of our viewers, Eric. This viewer asks, does the connection between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's suggest anything about the development of Alzheimer's in people without Down syndrome, or are we not there yet?
Well, it does. So, the leading theory regarding the development of Alzheimer's relates particularly to the issue of the buildup of amyloid, these amyloid plaques, and these tau tangles. And it's thought that in some people, particularly people with early onset Alzheimer's, people with Down syndrome, that the issues related to this increased risk are linked specifically to the overproduction of amyloid. Their bodies are producing too much amyloid throughout life. And when we think of late onset Alzheimer's, there's a link there too. Because even though those individuals may not be producing too much amyloid, what is known is they develop faulty brain mechanisms to clear amyloid from the brain. So there's a natural, say, waste system in the brain that is supposed to remove excess amyloid. As those proteins build up, they're supposed to be removed. So it's thought that one of the driving factors of late onset Alzheimer's too relates to amyloid, in that too much of it remains in the brain. These clearance mechanisms are faulty. So there is a link there.
So are there any things that people with Down syndrome can do specifically to reduce their risk for symptomology or dementia related to Alzheimer's?
That's a great question. I think we're all looking for things that we could do to, minimize our risk and keep our brains healthy. Unfortunately, there's not been a lot of work done on this topic in Down syndrome specifically, but in people without Down syndrome, there has been work done. And what's emerging in the little work that's been done in Down syndrome is quite similar to what we're seeing in people without. So some of the risk reducing strategies I think that we can control are not very different from what we should already be doing to keep our hearts healthy. And these include things like eat a healthy diet, move more, sit less, aim for a healthy weight, treat high blood pressure, don't smoke, things like that. But in addition to these strategies, there are some strategies, I think, that are a bit more specific to maintaining brain health. And one of those is to stay socially engaged lifelong. So develop a strong network of friends and maintain that. Staying mentally stimulated is important as well. So we should aim to be a lifelong learner, learn new things and challenge our brains. And also sleep. Getting quality sleep is important too. So we should aim for about 7 to 8 hours of sleep each night, not too little, not too much. So it's looking more and more like a healthy lifestyle can reduce an individual's risk to develop dementia.
I know staying socially engaged is a little bit harder these days.
I know. I always laugh about this too, because when we all want to know how we prevent Alzheimer's, but we already know how to prevent heart disease, and we all can ask ourselves, what are we doing to prevent that? And it's hard to motivate ourselves to move more and sit less and eat healthy, but we should strive for it.
Strong link between heart health and brain health, and so doing the things that are good for our hearts are also great for our brains.
Yep.
Eric, what types of resources and research studies are available for people with Down syndrome and their caretakers, specifically in the area of Alzheimer's research?
Sure. There are some excellent resources available on the National Down Syndrome Society's website that have been developed in recent years. There's 2 guidebooks there. One of them is a 44-page booklet on aging, just general aging with Down syndrome. And another one is a health and caregivers guidebook, specifically on the issue of Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. And both of those are very important resources, I think, for anyone who has an adult with Down syndrome in their lives to access. And you can access those, of course, by going to the National Down Syndrome's website and downloading them. They are free. And we also have a link to those resources on our iMind website. And also, I think since we're in the midst of a pandemic right now, I'd like to mention that the National Down Syndrome Society's website also has several relevant resources on COVID-19 and Down syndrome. And there are over 300 local Down syndrome support groups, as well as 70 specialty medical clinics throughout the country. Most of the clinics serve children, but with the aging of the population, as I mentioned, more and more clinics are opening up each year to serve adults. And right here at UCI, we have several specialty clinics for individuals with Down syndrome. We have a pediatric clinic at Chalk Children's in collaboration with the Down Syndrome Association of Orange County. In addition, for adults here at UCI, we have an adult primary care clinic, we have a dementia assessment and care clinic, and we have a behavioral health clinic. I'd also like to mention, too, that we have a Down syndrome Alzheimer's disease support group that's a collaboration between UCI, Alzheimer's Orange County, Regional Center of Orange County, and again, the Down Syndrome Association of Orange County. And with regard to participate in research, we have several ongoing studies funded by the National Institutes of Health that are focused on understanding more about the biological links between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's. And there's ways to reach us, of course, through the iMind website and links how to get in touch with me and other members of our team.
So that website Eric is referring to is www.mind.uci.edu. And under research studies, there's a specific section on our website dedicated to the UCI Down Syndrome Program and the various studies that are going on and the ways that you can contact to learn more and get involved. Another question here, Eric, related from a viewer is whether a Down syndrome diagnosis plays a part in the ability to contribute to clinical studies for Alzheimer's disease.
Whether a Down syndrome diagnosis plays a part in what now? The ability to?
Yeah, so I think maybe the question is asking if there's studies for people with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease versus studies for just people with Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
So
sure. So most of the studies on Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome are specifically tailored to that population. So, many of the things that we do, from, how we analyze our blood samples or even our spinal fluid samples or how we collect our brain images, is very similar, if not identical, to what we do in populations of people without Down syndrome. But because of the lifelong intellectual disabilities, we have to have assessment tools that are somewhat unique from what you would use in a population that did not have those challenges. So we have cognitive tests that are specific to people with Down syndrome. So most of the studies that are looking at the links between the two conditions are really only recruiting people with Down syndrome. And we have 4 such studies right here at UCI that are recruiting now. And there are more and more studies that are opening up around the country and around the world. Because as I mentioned, people with Down syndrome are at a very significant risk of this condition. And we are doing all we can to make opportunities to participate and make a difference available.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of really important studies going on right here in Orange County at UC Irvine. What are some of the future goals of these specific and upcoming projects? What are some of the specific things that you hope to learn?
Well, one of the things that we've learned in the past is if you try to intervene in this issue of Alzheimer's, when a dementia is already present, it might be too late. Because as I mentioned, those brain changes of Alzheimer's are accumulating throughout life. And it's thought that by the time a dementia is evident, the brain has been stripped of all of its abilities to compensate for those accumulating brain changes. So there's been a very dramatic shift in the last 10 years or so to try to diagnose Alzheimer's disease years or even decades before dementia occurs. So we're doing this from looking at biological samples that we analyze from blood, spinal fluid, brain imaging scans. Within the last 5 years or so, we now have the ability to image a brain and quantify how much amyloid is in brain. Before that time, there was really no way to see amyloid until the person came to autopsy after they passed away. So we're at a point now where we think we can start to identify these early biological changes in these specimens, and in essence, really diagnose Alzheimer's disease in an individual long before there's been a dementia-related change. And the hope is that we'll be able to develop some treatments once we can identify those folks and get them treated to keep their brain healthy.
All right, well, we're almost out of time. We had one more question come in from a viewer, and Eric, I'm hoping you can answer it for us pretty quickly.
I'll try my best.
What is the percentage of Down syndrome in the general population?
That's a good one. So the birth prevalence is about 1 in 1,000. And there's been some studies that looked at what the population prevalence is. And it too is becoming much higher than it was in the past because people with Down syndrome are living much longer. Now, they aren't quite yet to the point where they enjoy the longevity that the rest of us do. But it's thought now that about 1 in 1,500 people is an individual with Down syndrome. And it's estimated there's about 250,000 people with Down syndrome in the United States. And we know from the regional center of Orange County that there's approximately 2,000 people with Down syndrome here in the county and about 16,000 people in the state of California.
Wow, thank you for those statistics.
Sure.
Lastly, Eric, I just want to end on, for our viewers, what is one thing that you would want people to know about working with individuals with both Down syndrome and Alzheimer's dementia?
Sure. I'm already going to start to cry. So maybe I better not answer this one, but people with Down syndrome have touched my heart in many ways. And there's an observation I've made in my 20 years of experience. And that, I mentioned chromosome 21 and the genes that are responsible for the cognitive deficits of Down syndrome, or this issue of Alzheimer's. There are genes on chromosome 21 that also are responsible for the common personality traits that people with Down syndrome have. They're very endearing. They tend to have a very pure and joyful heart and a genuine fondness for people. And I'm reminded of this quote often by Maya Angelou that, reads something like, people won't remember, or they'll forget what you did, or they'll forget what you've said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. Mm-hmm. And this sentiment, I think, is very applicable to the life of a person with Down syndrome. They have a way to touch others that allow them in. So on many occasions, we've had family members, caregivers, or friends say such things as, they're the nicest person I know, and they make me a better person, or they're the glue that keeps our family together. And I believe this positive impact they have on the lives of other around that makes our world a better place. But I think, as importantly, I'd just like to say that even in the presence of a condition like Alzheimer's that progressively robs them of their memories and their skills, this particular gift they have, it exists throughout life. So they'll continue to influence and have a positive effect on people without them, even in the presence of a condition like Alzheimer's.
Well, Eric, you are truly amazing and an inspiration. And
they're amazing, not me.
You have such a pure commitment and dedication to the people you work with.
Do.
And to this important research that we're doing at UCI Mind, and it's truly an honor to work with you. Thank you for logging in today and for taking the time to answer our questions.
Sure.
And thanks to all of you who participated live today. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to join us next month, September 4th, to learn about the role that our immune system plays in Alzheimer's disease. With postdoctoral fellow and UCI Mind neuroscientist, Dr. Lindsay Hohsfield. In the meantime, to read daily updates about Alzheimer's research, as well as local COVID-19 resources, specifically for older adults, you can visit our blog. I'm going to put the website up here at mind.uci.edu/blog. Though our in-person education events are temporarily on hold, we are trying to reach out to people through virtual means such as this Facebook Live series and more frequent postings on our blogs and our social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help researchers answer questions about and solve problems about health disorders and crises in our country and in our world, you can sign up for the UCI Consent to Contact, or C2C Registry, to be contacted about research studies in healthcare that are happening specifically at UC Irvine. And the website for that is c2c.uci.edu. I hope that you're all staying safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks again for joining us. Bye.